if a trip to the Orient was going to cost $1,500 in 1960, that's pretty expensive. So the average American family could not go. So then we're looking at the upper middle income and saying, okay, and 1,500 may be the price. You have to keep that in mind. And now we're going to go to Japan and Hong Kong. We're going to call that Orient. And of course, there's much more to see in Japan than there is in Hong Kong. Hong Kong used to be mostly known for shopping. So you say, well, maybe 3 or 4 days in Hong Kong should be enough. And a trip, if they're going to go as far as Orient, should be at least 12 to 14 days. So then you figure out $1,500. What is the airfare? So what can we show in Japan? Well, the first place you look at is what hotels are there, you know. To have, and I can tell you all kinds of funny stories about the hotels in Japan, but and the Americans and the Canadians that go to Japan always would want to, they've maybe read about, always want to say, well, we want to stay at a Japanese inn. We want to stay at a Japanese inn. So you had to find an inn, and it was expensive. But also in the 60s, there were not many inns that had Western-style toilets. And you couldn't have an American or a Canadian use a Japanese-style toilet. So I would go to Kyoto and I would look for an inn, you know, a ryokan, that had Western-style washroom. That's number one that you have to look at. And, you know, some inns would say, 洋式便所あります。一つあります。Anyway, so you look for those, and you ask them. Also, at those days, you know, the Americans could not eat misoshiru and yakizakana for breakfast. So at least toast and coffee, you know. And I would go to a Japanese inn in Kyoto, look around. 外人さん泊まれますか? うちはちょっと外人さんはちょっと無理ですな。Only maybe 3 or 4 ryokans really took, you know, but they were expensive. Hiragiya and Tawaraya are very famous in Kyoto, and they would take hakujin. And they had Western-style toilets. So those are the things when you're doing your research. So, okay, what can they do in Tokyo? And I'm still looking at it from the perspective of the traveler, the North American traveler. So you have to find a hotel that has a fairly big bed, not the small Japanese bed. And in those days, in the 60s, there were maybe 5 hotels in Tokyo that would take American, 5 or 6. Imperial Hotel, Okura, Palace Hotel, and Tokyo Prince were not there yet, you know, that kind of hotel, or the Otani, you know. So only about 5 or 6 hotels that took Americans. And then on sightseeing, what do you do? In any city, there's what is called a typical half-day city tour. Well, you do the typical tour. But what can we do that is more interesting for the Americans? So I would look around and say, well, and I would work with JTB, I would work with Fujita Travel, and why don't we do Tsukiji? That would be fascinating, you know, because nobody in America or Canada would even know this kind. So, but if you're going to do Tsukiji, you have to get a bus at 4 o'clock in the morning or 4:30, and what do you do after Tsukiji? Where can we have breakfast? Where can we have a Western-style breakfast? So you figure out, you know, where you can have that. And then, okay, you know, if everything's over by 6:30, you know, what else can you do? So I said, well, we'll take them to the Tokyo station, and we'll see them watch the rush hour traffic. Just take them to the station, get a new joken, and everybody, if you get lost, you know, you come here, you know, make sure and just by being, 15 minutes around 8 o'clock in Tokyo Station, a train comes in with maybe 1,000 people coming down the stairs, So you look for things that would be interesting to the Canadian or the Americans. In 1968, September 1968, was the first Japan Airlines flight from Haneda to Vancouver. September 1968. And Japan Airlines for the first time flew into Vancouver. And I was still very active in I was very active in the travel business. So we were invited on what was called the inaugural flight from Vancouver on that return, to Japan. So through Compass Tours, we knew that the Japanese would be coming, so I increased the staff and to be able to handle the Japanese. And that became a eventually a large movement. So I set up a company called Cantour International in January of 1969. And I didn't have any money because all the money in Compass Tours was soaked up by the parent company. So I had 5 investors. Everybody put up $1,000 each, and I started Cantour with $5,000. But I had good contacts, and people in Canadian Pacific Airlines were very cooperative, and my friends in JTB and Fujita Travel, I was still able to send tours, and the business was just from Japan was beginning to pick up. And I think the other point to mention is, if you look at our history from 1965 to 1970, in the United States, there were many, many big problems. Number one, the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. Number two, the racial tension between the black and the white. Remember that Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and then Robert Kennedy was assassinated, and Martin Luther King was assassinated. So, and the Vietnam War was escalating, the anti-war movement, and there was all kinds of social unrest in the United States. In Canada, we had some problems, but nothing like that. And this is a time when Canada was being introduced, and the key words for Canada was clean air, majestic mountains, pristine lakes, everything was nature. That was the big sell, And I think from 1968, 70, 71, 72, Canada was the most desired destination for the Japanese in their survey. It wasn't, Hawaii was still very popular, but Canada, I think for the single woman, Canada was a big destination. Canada and Switzerland, although they couldn't. It was still fairly expensive, I suppose. But what also happened at that time, because Canada was coming into focus, people were beginning to talk about Canada. There's several other things that happened in that period. In 1966, Canada revised its immigration laws. And up to that time, they had a quota system, that every country there was a quota. But from 1966, they revised that immigration policy to a point system. And point meaning that there are so many categories education, language, experience, work experience, and age. There's so many age categories. And if you had points in every category, and if you had more than 50 points, you basically qualified. So there was no racial quota. And so that created interest. There are many young people in Japan that wanted to come to Canada.